Hello everyone and welcome to today's Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris. I'm a teacher trainer based in Wales in the UK, and today's topic is L1 in English language teaching, friend or foe? L1, also known as the learner's own language or first language in English language teaching. Is it a friend? Is it a foe, or is it potentially both? That's really what I want to tease out in today's masterclass. But before we dive into a bit of theory and a bit of the background to the topic, let me just share with you some of the main points that we'll be looking at during the masterclass today. So in terms of the topics covered, I'm going to begin by just putting this question, friend or foe, into its historical context and bring it also up to date. From there, I'll move on and talk about 5 opportunities for the principled use of L1 in English language teaching, 5 situations, 5 occasions during the arc of a lesson in which L1 use can be used with good reason. And because as teachers, we all like practical activities that we can take away and use in our own classes, I'll end with 5 activities which focus on L1 use. And then finally, at the end, as always, I'll draw some conclusions and also share with you some of the background reading that was involved when preparing today's masterclass. So let's dive in with that first topic, the one of, is the use of the student's own language in ELT something that we should be encouraging in a principled way, or should we really be looking at L1, English only, L2 use only? I'd like to begin with a bit of a survey of your position and what you feel right now. So I'm going to give you 3 scenarios or 3 positions as a teacher, and they're coming up on screen now in response to this question. How do you feel about this aspect of what happens in the English language classroom, the use of L1? Perhaps you think it's wrong, or maybe you think it actually makes sense, or you might not be sure or have a different view entirely. So could I ask you please in chat to identify if you are currently a teacher A, a teacher B, or a teacher C? And if you classify yourself as a teacher C, could I ask you just to explain briefly why you think that way? And we'll just pause now for a few moments for you to be able to put those answers into chat. Okay, so I think it's interesting to note the words of Steve Hirshhorn, a very popular presenter for gallery teachers himself. And this is what he said back in January of this year. And I quote, "We're past the stages of banning L1 in the classroom, aren't we? We can agree that L1 has a place in the monolingual classes where the group comprises multiple L1s. Now, I think there, when he said monolingual, he actually meant multilingual, as indicated by what he goes on to say about multiple L1s. But what I thought was interesting was also the fact that in the tag here, he didn't ask it as a question. He actually stated it as a statement. We are past the stages of banning L1 in the classroom, aren't we? Here then is a clear position from a highly respected teacher trainer and methodologist, arguing that L1 being banned in the classroom is something that we've moved on from. So how did we get to that position that L1 is now, in its principled way, used in our classrooms? Is it even true? Well, let's just take a quick overview of the history of L1 use. It's nothing new. So if we go back into the 19th century, and perhaps at the beginning of the birth of modern foreign language teaching and English language teaching in a big way. But one of the first methods that we encounter is grammar translation. And the image here of a French dictionary indicates the way in which, for example, I learnt French when I was at school in the 1980s, when I did A-level French, my leaving exam. And we used a course book where we were asked to translate the language of Dickens, for example, the English novelist, into French. So grammar translation, although it was replaced not a lot, into the 19th century, nevertheless, it continued to exist and be used well into the 20th century. However, as we often see with different methods, the method that replaces the dominant one, so the method which replaced grammar translation, very often has an extreme response to what came before. And in terms of what came after grammar translation, the direct method, we actually see a much less pro L1 position. The Berlitz schools continue around the world today, but a rather fantastic image here, great moustache of the founder of the Berlitz schools, Maximilian Delphinus Berlitz, who was really a proponent of the direct method. And in the direct method, there was to be a direct association of thought with the foreign language, the L2 in this case, English, and its sound, and the recommendation of constant and exclusive use of the foreign language, in this case, English. So we have here, right at the beginning of the history of modern language teaching, and by modern I mean from the 19th century onwards, two methods that almost summarize the polarized views about the use of the first language in the classroom. It's being banned by the direct method, but by it being a core part of grammar translation. If we bring the story more up to date, and a prize for anyone who can identify the building in the photograph on the left-hand side of the screen, is an attempt, I think, to try to bring up to date what I consider to be one of the reasons why L1 became unfashionable and considered inappropriate for many teachers. So, yes, this is International House London in one of its earlier incarnations in Shaftesbury Avenue, where in 1962, the first attempt at creating a training course for language teachers of English, based on communicative language teaching, CELT, first started. And even as late as the 1990s and potentially beyond, many teachers going through courses like the Prep CERT, which became CELT, and its equivalent, the CERT TESOL, was a kind of a belief that L1 should not be used. And I think this was in response largely to the kind of people who initially, at least, were taking those courses. And they were native teachers of English. They were trained either to teach in monolingual classes in countries where English was not the L1. So, for example, I went and I taught English in Italy. And for many of those teachers going to a foreign country, they simply didn't know the L1. So it was considered impossible, although I don't agree with that position, that they couldn't use L1 in their teaching, and therefore it was just easy to ban it. The other situation was where those teachers, like me, taught in language schools in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, America, Australia, New Zealand, Malta, where English was the L1 of the country, and where international students from many different nations came to learn English, and where you had a dominance of multilingual classes, where again it was argued that English had to be the only language used because there was no other language that all of the learners shared. Now, as we'll hear later, I think, in our discussion after this introduction, that position, I think, is almost untenable now. We recognise that even if you don't share an L1 with your students, that L1 can still be used very successfully and to the students' benefit. As we come bang up to date, there are, I think, two trends, not just in English language teaching, but in language education generally. And you may have come across the terms of plurilingualism, but also of translanguaging. They're not quite the same thing. Plurilingualism comes from language policy, and it is about the development of skilled workers and immigrants competent in a range of national languages, their own, plus the language of where they are working and living. Whereas translanguaging, which comes from a Welsh term coined by Ken Williams, and then was translated as translanguaging, is a strategy allowing for, and I quote, the planned and systematic use of two languages for teaching and learning inside the same lesson. And this has become a pedagogic reality for teachers of English as an additional language. One way in which it's operationalized, it's implemented, is that the students watch video clips in their home language, their L1, and working together, they construct collaboratively a translation of that video. So the focus moves away from not how many languages a learner may have. So if I think about when I was studying Italian, I had Dutch friends who spoke 5 or 6 languages, including English and Italian and Dutch and others very well, but moved towards how all of these languages are available to them as useful and valid resources to achieve their communicative purposes. Which really brings us back to the situation where we were in, where Berlitz was arguing against grammar translation. Is the use of L1 something that we consider as a positive that's friendly? Or rather, is it a foe? Now, in terms of L1 as being our friend, it does replicate real life. Any of you watching, I'm sure, at some point has asked the question, how do I say that in my language? We often want to know a translation. And indeed, if we consider bilinguals, it is part of the nature of using two languages bilingually that the users code switch. Plus, of course, there is this translanguaging turn, plus, of course, the rise of plurilingualism in language education policy. But of course, there are arguments against the use of L1, the learner's own language, L1 therefore as foe. It might be considered to be inappropriate in multilingual classes. And remember, multilingual classes are not necessarily just those that take place when we're teaching English in America, Australia, the UK, and so on. If you look at the teaching of German as a foreign language, quite often you will find that the students have come from multilingual backgrounds when learning German. Likewise, there is, I think, still in some cases pressure on teachers who do not share their students' L1, the monolingual context, to avoid L1 students' own language use. Plus, of course, the final point, there is that residue, I think, of cultural imperialism, the colonial aspects of English as a world language. It's probably becoming fairly clear already where I sit in terms of my position. And I do very much adhere to the belief that L1 is the friend rather than the foe. So in order to give some kind of rationale for that position, let's move on And I'd like now to look at some opportunities for principled L1 use. And I think the important point here is the word principled. I'm not saying that a teacher should just use L1 blindly without deciding why it's being used at a given point in a lesson, but rather I want to argue that it being used with reason often can help the language learning experience. So on this next slide, here are the 5 principled uses that I'm going to share with you. L1 for classroom housekeeping, L1 for the giving instructions, L1 for grammar explanations, L1 for the cognitively challenging tasks, such as global citizenship, that we see increasingly in the primary classroom. And then finally, its use in reflective journals, which, given by their nature, will almost certainly be used by adults rather than young learners and even probably teens. So what about classroom housekeeping, our first opportunity? Well, it seems to me that some of the points in the class itself, like taking the register, giving students their homework, and also important class announcements, are an interesting opportunity for the use of L1. So, for example, in a monolingual classroom, in any country where English is not the own language of the students, one way of using L1 is that you deliver this part of the lesson in the L1 of the learners, their own language. You can, of course, code switch. You can use both languages at the same time, much as bilinguals might do, or you can deliver in L1 and then use ICQs, instruction checking questions, in English, so students are exposed to both languages. And there is a choice there of whether the students respond in English, in their own language, or in a mixture. But as long as the students are identifying that they've understood the instructions that you've given them, then great. And then, of course, there's the opposite. Deliver the instructions in English, recognizing that that might be quite challenging for some of your students, but then do the check in L1. This seems to me, frankly, to be just common sense. If L1 is available to the teacher, then why not use it to make these parts of the lesson as efficient and as quick and as accurate, so the students really understand what's going on, as possible? That is really also the rationale for giving instructions in the lesson itself. So again, on screen, different ways in which this could be done. If you have the students L1 at your disposal, and most teachers around the world who teach English as a foreign language are in contexts where they are teaching students who share an L1 with them. People like me, the so-called native teacher, we are very definitely the minority. So deliver those instructions in L1, and as I said previously, check them in English, or do the opposite, and that's the second bullet point on screen. Another option, rather than using an ICQ, an actual instruction checking question, is that you deliver the instructions in English, and then in small groups, the students mediate that to their peers in their first language. So they may just translate it, repeat it in L1, or they may simplify it, or even deliver it in another way. So the spoken instruction might be shared by something written on a piece of paper and mediated that way. This is often the biggie, grammar explanations. And in preparing this webinar, I talked to a friend and colleague of mine with whom I run teacher training courses, and I asked him his view on using English L2 as the language of giving explanations of grammar. So, for example, if you're teaching students the difference between the past simple and the present perfect, which often involves meta language, subject, pronoun, auxiliary verb, main verb, past participle, or third form. Does it really make sense to do that in English? I'm not sure that it does. Okay, as teachers, we often feel quite pleased with ourselves when our students can repeat back at us in English the meaning, the form, and the pronunciation of a target language structure and the present perfect. But that doesn't actually mean that the student can use it. So the declarative knowledge that students have around, this is the present perfect, is not necessarily reflected in their ability to use it meaningfully in communication. So I kind of argue that there are often better, quicker ways of, or alternative ways, maybe better, for giving those grammar explanations. So if you're in that context where you share the same language as your students, why not give that grammar explanation in the student's own language and then check it in the student's own language, which is going to be quicker. More students will probably understand it, but it doesn't mean the students then won't be able to go on and practice and use it, as long as your practice activity and your activation activities are well set up. A grammar explanation in L1 is not going to have a negative impact on the student's ability to use the language in L2, in English. A change to this would be, again, still delivering that explanation in the student's own language, but then concept checking it in English. Or rather, like we saw with instructions, it's delivered in L1, and then the students re-explain it to one another. They mediate or code switch in a mixture of L2 and L1. The next one we look at, the fourth of my 5 opportunities, is to do with cognitively challenging tasks. What we see at all levels, including primary, is an increase in the use of things like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, across all levels, all age groups of the curriculum. Now, this work on SDGs is really valuable. It's really important. It's similar, therefore, to work on the awareness raising in terms of diversity and inclusivity. But for learners, and particularly the younger ones, this isn't just linguistically challenging, doing it in a foreign language, but it is also cognitively demanding. And there is a risk, I think, if the combination of the language and the cognitive demand is too great and the students just can't do it, that there is a resultant risk that they may become demotivated. Therefore, I think there is a place for principled L1 use as a way of scaffolding tasks. I'd like to show you an example of what I mean. So this comes from some quite recently developed materials working with primary level learners, and the topic is the development of kindness and respect in the community. As we might expect, there is a lot of use of imagery, of pictures to help the students so they can negotiate meaning. They can understand what is meant in English here by looking at the images. This is reinforced by a reading with a read and match activity. And then we get here, part 2, activity B, work in pairs, think and respond. Imagine your 8 or 9-year-old self. What personal qualities do you think these children and teens have? Which of them inspires you most? Why? What questions do you want to ask them? I can't imagine being able to answer that particularly well in my own language when I was 8 or 9. So just imagine how complicated that might be doing it in a foreign language, in this case, doing it in English. So I'd like to argue that where you have these cognitively challenging tasks, particularly at primary level, one way of doing this is actually deciding to bring the student's own language into the mix. So the students might actually discuss this in their first language, which the teacher can then mediate into English, and the students then give back in their version of English to the teacher and to each other. So we're moving from just L1 to a teacher mediating, a teacher recasting what they've said from L1 into English, the L2, and then the students listening to it, trying to get their mouths around it, and repeating it back in, if not an exactly perfect way that the teacher did it, but at least in English in some shape or form. And I think this becomes much more realistic than expecting students to be able to cope with that kind of deep dive into just answer the question in English. We know that pathways are made where there is a link between L1 and L2. So why not actually, neural pathways, I mean, so why not make advantage of this and actually get the students making those pathways between the idea in their first language, their own language, and in English? And then finally, my last opportunity for using L1 is actually to do with the use of reflective journals. Now, I spend a lot of time working with teachers whose language level is around the A2 level. I'm currently working on a project with A2 level teachers in Kazakhstan. And one of the things that we're encouraging them to do a lot is to share ideas and to reflect on what they're learning using an online reflective journal and also an online forum. Now, reflective journals can be done both in L1 and in L2. There was a really famous example of a reflective journal written by a second language acquisition researcher who was talking about or writing about the process of learning Portuguese. And that became the basis of his views on how our second language is acquired. But that was written in English, in the L1. So it is clear that an L1 journal written either by a teacher reflecting on what they're learning or by a student reflecting on what they're learning, the challenges they're facing, the successes they're having, the goal setting that they are making for themselves or being given by the teacher. When you are thinking about English language learning at certain levels, it will be impossible to do that in English only. At higher levels, it's a great way of practicing writing, but at lower levels, it is a valuable activity, but it can probably only be done in a student's own language, and why not? Okay, so that brings us to the final part of today's masterclass, where we're going to share with you some actual activities where L1 is at the heart and aimed to improve students' English language learning. Now, in order to make sense of these activities, which I have taken some directly from the work of Philip Kerr, and in other cases, I've adapted them or reflected on what I've done in my own teaching. I'd just like to share with you the three types of English language teacher that might exist. So type A is an English monolingual teacher. She teaches students who come from different language backgrounds, and there is no shared language. Now, the students will probably use translation themselves, and probably often quite badly. You know, it's little dictionaries that students used to arrive with are about that big. And I think one way of working with them is getting the students to think for themselves about the differences between L1 and English, the target language. Type B is again a monolingual English teacher, so probably a native teacher, but who shares a community language with the learners. So if I was working in Italy, I would be a type B teacher. Sorry, no, I wouldn't. I'd be type C. If I was working in a school in Germany, I would probably be a type B teacher. I don't speak German, but the students share a language, and therefore that, again, that comparison between the language that the students share. So in Germany, there may be Turkish students in the classroom who have German, which is the language they share as the classroom language in their German school. Okay, so here it's not just about their L1, so there might be some Turkish L1 students in a German school, but the teacher, like me, is a native one. Type C, the teacher knows the same language as the students themselves. So me working in Italy, where I'm a very competent speaker of the language, I can use that knowledge to good effect in the classroom. So can I just ask you, before we look at these 5 activities, to answer this question for yourself? In your current teaching context, are you teacher A, B, or C? And the reason for that is that the 5 activities I'm going to share with you are identified as being available to sometimes A, B, and C, sometimes more B and C, but not A, and so on. So here are the 5 activities that I think work really nicely using L1. Contrastive analysis, available to all of the teachers, I believe. Mediation, certainly teachers B and C, maybe A. And bilingual substitution drilling, similar group of teachers, B and C, arguably A could potentially do it. And then using videos with language subtitles, like number 3, teachers B and C, maybe A. And then finally, recasting, which is primarily, I think, for teacher C, but maybe available to teacher type B. Now, contrastive analysis as a main thrust of what we do in the classroom has really gone out of fashion. But it is a way of enabling students to identify similarities and differences between their own language, the L1, and English. So, for example, if I was working with a group of Romance language speakers or German speakers, and we were looking at the difference in structure between their language and English, we might look at the fact that in English we use the present perfect, but Italian, French, and German use a present form to translate the idea of I've lived here for 5 or I've lived here for many years. Vivo qui da molti anni. J'habite ici depuis 5 ans. Ich lebe hier seit 5 Jahren. All those European languages use this present form, where English uses the present perfect. And that's useful to notice, I think. At a vocabulary level, Malay students might expect to say and to hear at the beginning of a speech, gentlemen and ladies, because that's what Malay does. But English does ladies and gentlemen. So we can contrast vocabulary. Great activity here would be false friends. So there is, therefore, in using contrastive analysis, here my examples are Romance languages, European languages, a way of raising student awarenesses of how their language and English differ. Now, mediation is something that has happened for years and years and years in the language classroom. I presented on mediation for gallery teachers previously, and I believe is a forthcoming, hopefully, further gallery teachers masterclass on mediation. But recently, Riccardo Chiappini and Ethan Mansour published a fantastic teacher resource looking at the use of mediation in the classroom. One of which was What's on the Menu, where students take a menu from their first language, which might include food types that don't even exist in the UK or America. And they have to work between the two languages to move the menu from own language into English. So you're mediating a text here, the menu itself. But of course, there are other types of mediation, and we can look at these in a bit more detail during the discussion. There's the mediation of communication. Ricardo and Ethan here look at intermediators, but also as a further example of mediating a text is where students are shown a video and then they report on it or they summarize it. And the video, by the way, is in their own language, but they then report on it or they summarize it in English. No subtitles for that video. They just watch that short video and then they move the message that is in a video into either a spoken or a written summary or report. A lot of teachers love drilling. So can we use L1 in drilling? And the answer is yes, we can. So I thought here the best thing to do is actually give you an example of how this works. So if I was wanting to work with aspects of intonation and contrastive stress, I might begin by drilling in English with a group of teachers. London is the capital of England. London is the capital of England. And I might work with the stress that London is the capital of England. We then nominate a student to translate this into the L1. And this works well if the teacher shares the student's own language. If that translation by the student is correct, the teacher says it aloud and then says it again by making a change in meaning. So rather than sì, Londra è il capitale degli Stati Uniti, sorry, Londra è il capitale dell'Inghilterra, and then changes it to Londra non è il capitale degli Stati Uniti. And the students are nominated to translate it back into English, which if it's done correctly is then drilled. London isn't the capital of the United States. So the moving from L2 to L1 and back again capitalizes both on meaning, but also the student's ability when the translation is done, that the student hopefully identifies where to place the stress. And this keeps repeating. So once we've done London isn't the capital of the United States, that's translated into back into the student's L1. A further change is made. Paris isn't the capital of Japan, and so you move on. So it's a substitution drill working at an intonation level, but working through the two languages at the same time, which is, I think, the way that many people actually conceptualize the language they're learning. Two more to go. Videos with own language subtitles. There are a number of different ways of working with this one, but it begins with you choosing a suitable short video, 2-3 minutes, which has subtitles that are available in both English and in the student's own language. Things like TED Talks and YouTube are a great way of finding these. One way of working with this is that the students watch the video and the sound is down really low. So based primarily on what they see, the students discuss in groups what they've understood. And depending on their level, that discussion can be in L1 or in English in L2. The students then watch the video again, but this time the volume is high so they can hear the recording in English. This video, by the way, I should have said, is a video in English where the speakers are speaking English. The students repeat. They then now discuss what they've understood the second time. It's repeated a third time, but with English subtitles. They get together, they discuss what they now understand, and then finally they watch the short video again for the fourth occasion, but this time with L2 subtitles. And the students then compare what they understood first time round and what they understood in the final listening, and then bring in a bit of assessment for learning, not just what did they understand, but what helped them to understand better each stage on. And by the students becoming aware of how the different scaffolding that was made available, the increase so that the sound was available in stage 2, the English L2 subtitles in stage 3, the own language subtitles in stage 4. It's kind of sensitizing them to where their listening makes the biggest improvement and how they can then work to improve the other areas. This isn't the only way of doing it. I've seen this done where the students watch the video immediately with subtitles in their L1. They then watch it again with the subtitles in English, and then the final watch is done with no subtitles. And the idea being that you've scaffolded in the first listening with L1 subtitles, you've reduced the amount of scaffolding in the second watching with English subtitles. So by the time the students watch the video for the third time, they're successful and they're independent because that scaffolding of the subtitles has been removed. So this now brings us to the fifth and final activity that we can use. Now, as I was looking at Kerr's wonderful resource, his book on the use of students' own language, I came across this one and thought, actually, that's what I've always done with students, where I share an L1 with them, and that is recasting. And the best way to look at that, I think, is just to give you an example taken from Kerr's book. So this is a Romanian learner of English who says, in response to the teacher's question, presumably, oh, what did you do at the weekend? Oh, last Sunday, we went to Gradina Zoologica. And the teacher responds by saying, oh, you went to the zoo. Interesting. Did you have a good time at the zoo? So notice here in the recast, the teacher takes the Romanian lexical item Gradina Zoologica and recasts it into L2, into English, by simply repeating what is said using the correct form. You went to the zoo. And of course, intonation can be used to emphasize that word, to draw attention to the fact that this is the recast. But what I think is really nice here is that rather than stopping the flow of discussion, because after all, this is a meaning-based interaction. Tell me about the weekend. What did you do? Rather than stopping that flow of communication, saying, no, stop everyone. Gradina Zoologica, that's Romanian. How do we say that in English? Zoo. And the student's flow is totally interrupted. Rather nicely, by using this recast method, the teacher still provides the correct English term, zoo, but maintains the flow of meaning by responding to the students, I went to the zoo, with a follow-up question based on the interaction and the communication. Did you have a good time at the zoo? So recasting is something that many of us are doing already. It's becoming more a point of focus for English language teaching, as it is, in fact, one of the opportunities available to us when we work with emergent language. But it is my final activity when we're talking about L1 use in the classroom, and as I think a very simple but very powerful one. So to conclude, it really is the case that L1 use in English language teaching is not only being revisited, but I think it is largely being seen as a positive. I was lucky enough to be at a big meeting of British Council senior managers earlier this week, and a lot was being said about the multilingual, plurilingual contexts in which English teaching is happening around the world and how that must be included in appropriate methodology. We've always had opportunities for L1 use in our classes from ever since. What we're aiming for, I think, is principled use, as we've talked about today. So I would suggest establish what's realistic in your context based on your students' own language or languages, the language or languages that you share or don't share with them, and basically give it a go. To find out more, here are some of the sources that I've used today. But of course, inevitably, when we talk about English language teaching, these masterclasses, they're not in a silo. Today, we've had emergent language, we've had mediation, as well as L1 use. So I do recommend the Gallery Teachers Workshop Library, because I know for a fact, because I was lucky enough to watch them when they went out live, that there are recordings on exactly that, mediation, and on emergent language, and many other really interesting topics from experts. And of course, not just the expert presenter, but the expert audience sharing their views in the discussion afterwards. So I really do recommend this as a really fantastic resource for your own and perhaps also for some of your colleagues, CPD. So thank you very much indeed for sharing this part of the masterclass with me. And I really look forward to the conversation that follows.